Hello， 大家好。欢迎大家来到今天这个 HitCon 这个2024第一场正式的议程。那我是这场议程主持人 GD， 也是这个议程委员会跟这个筹备团队的成员。今天是 HitCon 这个20周年的活动。那在这个特别的时刻，我们邀请到非常重量级的前辈啊，这位是前这个卡巴斯基 Great Team 这个的 Director。那我相信，如果在大家有 follow 各种部落格、资安研究部落格，都会看到最尖端的研究，像是 APT 研究，在过去的这20年内有非常多重要的发现，从这个 Stuxnet 到 Flame 到这个不论是俄国的这个 Doku， 还是这些北韩的 Larus Group， 或甚至是这个美国的 Equation Group， 那这些 group 都是由卡巴斯基率先这个找到，并且发成部落格。那所以呢，大概30年前，这位这个讲师 Costin 他加入卡巴斯基担任这个研究员，那一路到总监的位置。那我自己是在12、13年前才入这一行的，我每天看这些部落格都觉得他们非常非常的厉害。事实上，今天我们 HitCon 的议程有4位这个前卡巴这个 Great Team 的成员。那分别他们现在已经到不同的公司去，但是也担任这个不同议程的讲师。所以在我的心目中，这一直是这个业界的指标，就是他们率先发现了非常非常多的新的威胁，那并且揭露给世人。今天这场议程非常的特别，这个我们请 Costin 来为我们介绍这个 The Big Bang of Cybersecurity Emergencies。这 emergency 是指有2个意思，一个是紧急的时刻，一个是特殊的发现，这个 emerging 一个新产生的事情。那这非常符合我们HitCon 20周年的精神，因为我们想要见往知来，看过去20年发生什么事情。所以呢，讲师会为我们介绍1990到2024之间这30几年新的顶尖的威胁，包含旧的 APT 到新的 APT 到最新的 AI 的发展。那让我们用热烈的掌声欢迎 Costin 为我们带来这场演讲。
Good morning. Thank you for showing up to the talk, and thank you to the organizers of HitCon for having me. It's the first time for me at HitCon, and I love it already, and also the first time for me in Taiwan. And I hope to be able to come back again. I love it. It's a beautiful place, and I think the conference is also very, very exciting, and a lot of potential for very interesting discussions. So this morning I want to challenge you a bit and talk about how to, let's say, learn from the last 30 years in security. I started working in computer security around 1993. I remember in the beginning of the conference we were thinking, how was the world 20 years ago? Just remember maybe how many of you were in computer security 30 years ago? Maybe you can raise your hands. Yeah, sorry about that. I'm passionate about APTs, 0 days, and chess. I found a number of APTs. I reported them to Microsoft, and Microsoft sent me a hat for that. And recently I started training in Taekwondo, which is a Korean martial art. We started training during the pandemic, during the COVID pandemic because of lockdown. And actually that was the only place that was still open and to be able to do some kind of gym. I'm a big fan of VirusTotal and Yara. How many people use VirusTotal? Maybe? All right, fantastic. Now, I like to think that the world we live in is shaped by emergencies. Just think about COVID-19 and what the impact of COVID-19 was on our world. But my journey in computer security, it started around 1993 when our high school network was infected by a new virus. If you remember this time was when people were using BBSs, just like today, by the way, and antivirus updates were being delivered every couple of weeks from BBSs. And now this infection, people started noticing it because floppy disks were starting to develop bad sectors. How many people remember floppy disk? Okay. I tell you, one of the most dreaded things about floppy disk was when you put the floppy disk in someone's computer and it scratched it. So after getting scratched, it started developing bad sectors. So from now on, you knew how to avoid that person's computer. You don't put your floppy disk in there anymore. So what was happening in our school network is that all the floppy disks were developing bad sectors. And they shut down the network, and my colleagues were very happy. I was not very happy because I wanted to work on the computers. And the professor, they brought the top-of-the-line antiviruses of that age, which was McAfee antivirus, Thunderbite antivirus, FPROT, and none of them had the ability to catch this virus. So I spent a night. I didn't sleep that night because I wanted to develop an antivirus solution for it. And, well, my solution, like initial one, was just to check if the last bytes of the files contain these bad sector strings. And if there was like this bad sectors string in there, I would just try to repair the file, restore the entry point, patch the entry point, remove the malware, and so on. And it was quite successful. And this is how I got into security. And everything was fine until May 12, 2017. How many people remember this date, May 12, 2017? It was a Friday. So normally on a Friday, you want to relax, you know, it's a weekend. So I got a call in the morning from one of our teammates in Spain, and he said, we have big problem in Spain, all the banks are down. And what you see on the screen of the banks looks something like this. And yeah, Desigual, a very famous Spanish clothing brand, and they also had these red screens with WannaCry. I think Sberbank in Russia also affected. So it was pretty much everywhere. And it was like, I would say, one of the really big emergencies of the last decade. And the reality is that all these different big emergencies, I think that they change the way that we look at the world. And they force us to take some new, let's say, measures, to think about updates. And the funny thing is that WannaCry was exploiting a vulnerability that has been patched for 3 months already. And nevertheless, for some reason, people didn't update or the patch didn't correctly install. And this is why it pretty much spread everywhere. And it was actually so big that, you know, people started making fun of it, that it affected all sorts of devices, Nokia phones, microwave ovens, washing machine, smart glasses, air conditioning, smartwatch, Nintendo old computers, Nintendo, yeah, Tesla cars, and even the Matrix was affected by WannaCry. And once again, you said, okay, people learned a lot of lessons from WannaCry until July 19, 2024, which happens to be also Friday, if you remember this day. I woke up in the morning, I think it was about 8 a.m., that my wife was talking on the phone with tech support from her company, and you know, she was talking very loudly. And I asked, like, what's going on? What's happening? She said, the computer is broken, nothing works. Somehow my computer broke. And I said, can you show me? And it looked something like this. And I immediately I looked at that screen and said, what failed CS agencies? And I said, CS agencies, this is possibly, I don't know, CrowdStrike agent, something like that. And I didn't even know that their company was using CrowdStrike. And then I looked a bit on X, on Twitter, And I realized that it was not just my wife, it was everyone's wife and themselves and the world. So it was much bigger. And in the airports, you know how that goes already. Yeah, I think actually with this case, it wasn't just the blue screen itself, but the fact that it was really difficult to fix Windows because of BitLocker. So the biggest issue in this case, I think it was the difficulty of recovering systems without, you know, knowing the BitLocker key. It's impossible. So that was, like, I think, pretty bad. And there's a lot of discussions how to do the world more resilient, but it feels, you know, that from 93 to 2017 to 2024, you know, some things pretty much remain the same. And by the way, beware of fakes. Like these photos here, they're obviously not real, and sometimes it's more difficult to spot these fakes. So just to give you an example, here's two blue screens, and which one is real and which one is fake? Like, raise your hands if you think the one on the right is fake. Okay, yeah. I think the one on the right is fake because it says ATIKMPAG.sys, and that's not the CrowdStrike agent. And also, I think the blue screen is not from Windows 11, it's actually from Windows 7. So the one on the right, which was actually used for some news stories about this, it's fake, it's not real. And speaking of fake news, I think that this is a pretty big phenomenon. Speaking of emergencies, of course, the US elections are pretty much everywhere nowadays. And maybe some people don't remember that before the 2016 elections, there was a hacker called Guccifer. This is actually a Romanian hacker, and he became quite famous. His name is actually Marcel Lazar Leher, and his occupation was a taxi driver. So how he got, you know, to become a hacker from being a taxi driver is quite impressive, because he essentially says he read everything online. So he was only using online tutorials and became a hacker, combining the style of Gucci with the light of Lucifer. Obviously, there are some issues there. He had no skills, again, nothing. He didn't know anything except what he found on the web. And nevertheless, he was able to hack Colin Powell, the Rockefeller family, FBI and Secret Service agents, Corina Crețu and George Mayer. Corina Crețu was a Romanian politician, and George Mayer was head of the Romanian intelligence service. So nobody really cared about this guy in Romania, the country where I am from, until he hacked the head of the Romanian intelligence service. So they didn't care much. They hacked Colin Powell, the FBI, and so on. But when he hacked the George Mayer head of intelligence and called him a skunk, and then he tried to blackmail the head of Romanian intelligence, he was arrested in 2 weeks. So that was pretty fast. Now, what is interesting is that the Democratic National Committee was hacked in 2016, and this introduced a new persona called Guccifer 2.0. And Guccifer 2.0, he pretended to be a Romanian hacker as well. What he said in this interview with Lorenzo Franceschi Bicherai, who is a reporter from Motherboard, when he asked him, "Where are you from?" he said, "I'm from Romania." So then the reporter asked him in Romanian, using Google Translate, "Do you want to talk for a bit in Romanian?" And he replied something like, "Yeah, vorbiți limba română," which means, "Do you speak Romanian?" And the reporter asked him, "Why did you put Russian metadata in the documents you are leaking?" And then he says something, "Este filigranul meu." And then he uses this word filigran several times. Then he says, "Yeah, there's also these watermarks in Spanish, and maybe you don't know what is a watermark." Now, the funny thing is that in Romania, nobody uses this word. Like, I don't think I ever used it in my life, or maybe once or twice, because it's not typical. You just say it's a watermark. So we just use the English equivalent for that word. And there were also like a bunch of other mistakes in the communications with Guccifer. For instance, he would say, yeah, vorbiți limba română, which is wrong. You say normally vorbiți limba română, it's unusual. And there's all sorts of typical mistakes that appear with the translation program. But if you translate from English, it is my watermark, you get exactly that in Romanian, this special word, filigrane, which explains, why he was using it, despite the fact that nobody in Romania knows it. And then what is interesting is that the FBI, they indicted a number of hackers from the Moscow-based Unit 74455 of the GRU, so the Russian military intelligence. And what is interesting in this indictment, they say like some of the terms that he was searching on Google. So they had access to their Google search history. And for instance, some hundreds of sheets, and you can actually find all these terms in his blog posts. Some hundreds sheets, think twice about the company, so it all explains that he was not really a Romanian hacker, but was somebody trying to push stolen materials. And what's also interesting is that in the network of the DNC, there were two APT groups, APT28, also known as Fancy Bear, and APT29, also known as Cozy Bear, at the same time, which is, I think, typically in APT investigations, you can find in interesting places, you can find multiple APT groups. I call those places magnet of threats. So you can find sometimes 4, or I think the highest we have ever saw was 5 different APT groups on the same server. Those are the most interesting cases. So if you have the capability to monitor such VIP victims, if you want, you can always find new fresh stuff. So this was one of the magic, if you want, solutions that we had into finding interesting APT groups. So speaking about these influence operations and attempts to change elections, I think possibly the most interesting and the most active countries engaging in this are probably Russia, China, and Iran. But I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and the general from a country in Europe spoke there, and he said, of course that we want to have this capability. Of course that everybody wants to have this capability. But of course, different countries have different interests. Obviously, Russia is very active in Ukraine, against the United States, against European Union. China, of course, very active against Hong Kong, Taiwan, United States, India, Australia, Canada, Japan, and Iran. I think most recently, they tried the Guccifer 2.0 style attack against the Trump campaign, in particular APT35 and APT42. They tried to hack and then leak, but the journalists, they already knew, so they were at least familiar with this, and they didn't publish the stories, which essentially means that people can learn. We can learn from emergencies, we can learn from mistakes, and I think that means that there is hope. So in this case, the hacker pretended to be just Robert, no Guccifer, no the light of Lucifer style of Gucci. Journalists were asking, where did you get the documents? And he said, don't ask the questions to which, I cannot answer. Now, in many of these cases, when you investigate attacks, I like to think that it's similar to a visit to the Paleontology Museum. And we apply this concept a lot of times in our research. So one example here is that, sometimes people see things like maybe a monster in the lake, or it's a dragon, if you want, and you don't actually know, is it a dragon? What's that? Is it the head? Are those the humps of the snake or the dragon? Sometimes you can either, let's say, have some impressions, but in reality, it's not a dragon, maybe it's just some islands. But nevertheless, in many cases, when you investigate attacks, you only have very small bits and clues. And I think one of the important capabilities that we developed in the community is the ability to put together those bits and pieces and come up with attribution. Like for instance, this message that was posted by Neil Mehta from Google on May 15, 2017. Like nobody knew what WannaCry was, and there was essentially no attribution anywhere until he posted this message on Twitter. And when he posted that, immediately everyone said, aha, now we know who is behind WannaCry. Because essentially what you have in there is 2 hashes and offsets. And if you actually open those 2 files and you compare the code at those particular offsets, you see that code with the call to the rand is essentially a hashing function that implements a predefined random number generator. And it's the same code. And what you have here is a sample of WannaCry and the really old sample used by the Lazarus group, which is a North Korean state-sponsored APT group. So then I remember that back then some companies said there's no way in the world that a nation state can launch destructive attacks because there is no benefit for them. And we know that it has changed a lot in the last years. But essentially it means that it's possible to attribute attacks by looking at the common code between them. So one example here is ShadowPad malware, which is used by multiple Chinese APT groups. The first time we saw ShadowPad, and I think I'm the one who named it ShadowPad, because it was connecting to a domain called notepad.cc, and it was doing it in a kind of a hidden manner, so that we called it ShadowPad. But essentially, we did an incident response for a customer, and they had a computer in their network that was trying to look up non-existent domains. And they wanted to know why. Why is this computer doing that? So we did a memory dump. We searched the memory dump for those domain names. And we found that it was actually coming from a process called NetSarang. NetSarang is a management software from a South Korean company. And in there we found like it was a really interesting piece of code, but we weren't sure, is it malware or not? Because all that was doing was try to query these domains and receive a decryption key from those domains. So only if you had the right decryption key. But we were able to break the encryption, and inside there were code which is quite similar to the poison plug malware. And poison plug was originally used by APT41. APT41 is probably one of the most prolific Chinese APT groups. What you have here is the ShadowPad plugin on the left side, and there's this plugin from an APT41 WinNTI incident. So if you look at the code, it's pretty obvious what it does, or not. Maybe it's easier like this. It's, yeah, just another API hashing function. So it's possible to, when you look at new attacks, it's possible to correlate them to older attacks. So APT41 in particular, they have a very unique nature in the world of APTs. They're kind of dual in the sense that they combine cyber espionage with financially motivated activity. So, for instance, in this case, they were spearphishing a Taiwanese newspaper with the subject, "I have a little surprise for you." And the same email address was used to target a cryptocurrency exchange in June 2018. So just maybe the same as Lazarus, who we know that has a dual nature. They're targeting both for espionage and for financial gain. Similarly, APT41 is one of those anomalies that work in the same way, very dynamic, very creative. Their ability, you know, the persistent, so-called persistent in APT, I think is pretty good. Another example of a supply chain attack like that is a CCleaner incident, originally discovered by Morphisec. In here, the shellcode that we were able to find was similar to the missile backdoor from APT17, which is another very interesting APT group. Missile is actually the handle of one of the hackers who was essentially operating part of APT17. APT17, I think they became famous when they targeted Google in Operation Aurora, which was one of the, I think, the first early APT cyber espionage cases, and actually forced Google to get rid of Windows in their networks. Yeah, so I was able to find that, and we posted about it on Twitter. But the thing is that this doesn't always work, and it's important to know about the failures. For instance, in the case of Olympic Destroyer, Israeli company Intezer, they found similarities between Olympic Destroyer with APT-10, APT-3, and APT-12. Then Recorded Future, they found similarities with the Lazarus, North Korean APT. So there's a lot of pointers there. APT-10 is Chinese, APT-3 is Chinese, APT-12, if I remember correctly, is Vietnamese, and yeah, Lazarus is North Korean. So what is it, actually? And the interesting part here is that if you compare the wiping modules of Olympic Destroyer with Blue Norov, you can actually see they're quite similar. They're not identical, but the functionality is kind of similar. So you could say, and then actually even our own system back in the days, it found similarities with Lazarus malware. And we said, yeah, it has to be Lazarus. It was during the Olympics, Winter Olympics in South Korea. So we thought that this must be North Korea. But the interesting part here is that the similarities were actually in the rich header of the PE file. So if you look there between these two files, Olympic Destroyer and Blue Norov, the rich header feature of PE files is actually identical. And it cannot be identical. It's very unlikely for this to be identical between two samples. And actually, we were able to figure out that it was copy-pasted. So they took it from Blue Norov, and they put it into Olympic Destroyer in order to deflect security researchers to think that actually it is North Korea, when in reality it was not. It was what we are calling the Hades APT, or also known as sandworm. So it was definitely not that, but nevertheless, a lot of people made mistakes, which makes me think that many times threat research, threat intelligence research looks like paleontology, because there's an art in finding these dinosaur skeletons. You need to add detection, you need to reverse the samples, decrypting encryption or breaking encryption, understanding lateral movement, outlining multiple stages, mapping CNCs, sinkholing. So there's a lot of work which needs to be done, and all of that is more like, finding, trying to understand what happened there. And I think that companies which have the ability to find cyber dinosaur skeletons will be a lot more successful than others, because the ability of understanding attacks in depth and understanding things to write a comprehensive report is a very powerful ability in our sphere. And this leads me to another point here, which is unsolved cyber paleontology. So in many cases, you can find out who was behind it, but also in many cases, we don't know who it was. So one of the most interesting cases that I worked at Kaspersky back in the days, it was Wild Neutron. I worked on many cases, probably more than hundreds. I can talk about some of them. I cannot talk about many of them for obviously sensitive reasons. But this one in particular, it kind of stayed in my mind because, well, they were incredibly famous and then kind of disappeared. So they became actually famous when they infected Facebook, Twitter, Apple, and Microsoft at the same time with the 0-day in 2013, which is, I think, a quite impressive ability. They used the Java vulnerability back in the days, but we were able to track them down to at least 2011. So they've been in this game for a very, very long time, leveraging 0 days, and probably we think they're still active. They did have a medium to high degree of sophistication. They used at least 2 or 3 0 days. They had their own custom exploit kit. They used stolen certificates to sign their code. They had multi-platform malware for Windows, Mac, and Linux. awesome operational security. So just to give you an example here, with Wild Neutron, when they hacked into all these American technology companies, a three-letter agency became very interested in Wild Neutron. So they used their magic to hack into one of the Wild Neutron command and control servers, and they found that the operators were connecting from China. So they used their magic again, they hacked the operators of this malware to find that they were actually Chinese APT developers. But they looked further and they found that they were Chinese APT developers infected with the proxy malware that someone else was using. So Wild Neutron actually infected a bunch of Chinese APT developers just to proxy their traffic and hide behind the false flags, which I think is what makes them essentially the masters of false flags. And the rumor is that this three-letter agency was never able to actually find out who was behind Wild Neutron or who is. Both Symantec and Kaspersky publish reports about Wild Neutron, so if you're interested, you can read them. But there were a lot of unusual things, like, for instance, the targeting. Usually, the targeting is most interesting for me, because depending on the targeting, I can tell you what are their interests. So let's say if they're targeting mostly governmental geopolitics, obviously they're supporting an intelligence agency. If they're targeting Bitcoin companies, they must be driven by financial reasons. So in here, they were targeting law firms, Bitcoin companies, investment companies, real estate, healthcare, large company groups involved in mergers and acquisitions, IT companies, forums, some individual users, and no government. Like, this is the most surprising thing, that they were not targeting any governments. So we were thinking, what are they? Are they mercenaries? Are they working for like some kind of entity that is just staying away of targeting governments? Like one example here is how many people got infected by visiting these two forums, Fedora Forum and iPhoneDevSDK.com. If you visited them together with a few others, you'd get targeted with a Java 0-day and get infected on Mac and Windows. The most interesting here are community FlexiSpy and Ansar1.info. They were also waterholed and delivering 0 days. In particular, Ansar, this was Ansar al-Mujahideen, which is a terrorist forum. So who infects terrorist forums, essentially to target terrorists? It has to be some kind of a counter-terrorism operation, right? But usually the people who do CT work, they don't target Bitcoin companies. So like the way the exploits were delivered, for instance, they had their own custom exploit kit that we were never able to recover using SVF files, but also it did fingerprinting of the system before and only triggered in certain conditions. But some of the domains used here, like Cloud Protect, PDF Info, they were used repeatedly for delivering 0-day exploits. And the 0-day exploits essentially were delivering their main backdoor, the JRIP backdoor, with multiple different versions over the years. Now, after gaining access to a system, they would typically upload another binary, sometimes named updt.dat, and this was a reverse SSH. They had this version for Windows, Linux, and OS X as well. And they were using actually hard-coded RSA private keys in there for authentication. So it was implemented quite properly in a way that you know, it cannot be hijacked easily, let's say. Now, the other crazy story here is that they were using a stolen certificate from a company called Acer. How many people heard about Acer? Okay, a few people. We tried to warn them, so we called Acer and tell them that, listen, it looks like your code signing certificates have been stolen. And the most shocking reply to us was that, yes, we know. We know. Okay. So if you know, you know. Yeah. But eventually the certificate was revoked. And that one in particular, that sample was used to target a cryptocurrency exchange. Another very interesting module they had, it was an SSP plugin. They were one of the very few APT groups using SSP plugins. This actually work as authentication plugins in Windows. Another, let's say, group that was using this, I think, was RAMSEC. But in general, APT groups don't rely on this technique. They just use, for instance, Mimikatz to capture credentials or to bypass authentication. There's an interesting Mandiant presentation that mentions the same technique as being used by APT groups, but they don't give any indicators of compromise. And what they did there was like they just authenticated the client using a password and hashing that password against and checking it against the MD5 value on the screen. If I remember correctly, we were never able to crack this MD5. So if you want to try, you can for sure go ahead. You'll find it probably in our blog from back in the days, but we were not able to crack this MD5 and find their password. And this was already version 1.3b, which means they had several versions over the years. And the client-side tool was also very detailed, very difficult to create a detection for it, because mostly, let's say, benign strings. So, yeah, it's not available on VirusTotal if you're looking for it, unfortunately. And we think that if this was to be uploaded to VirusTotal, you probably have very, very low detection. Now, they also had an IIS plugin that we see deployed in the wild, and this was quite funny because it would check for requests that have the first 4 bytes as APT2. So we thought that this was a reference to Mandiant APT1 report. So they put APT2 there, maybe just to be cool or something. Followed by the checksum, number of arguments, and this, for instance, was deployed against a newspaper in France. So all sorts of targeting around the world. And many people, of course, they try to attribute. For instance, one of their tools, whenever it disconnects from the command and control server, it sends this message, La revedere. La revedere means goodbye in Romanian. So I was like, wow, maybe they're Romanians, the Romanian APT. But also they have the string uspешно, which I think is Polish or possibly Russian, depending how you interpret it. So there's like a Romanian, maybe some kind of Russian links in there. But also what was interesting there, like one of their CNCs was registered by a guy called Thomas Zbroja, which is an investment banker. Actually, a person exists by this name. Well, yeah, if you think about it, it makes sense. They were targeting investment companies. But also, for instance, one of their domains, Live Analytics, was hosted on an IP address who belonged to a company called Backlog Capital. Now, Backlog Capital was an investment company as well. They were investing in high-tech and healthcare. So they also said that we understand the hidden value in high-tech companies that traditional bankers are unwilling to evaluate. So you might wonder, how do they understand this hidden value? Is it like maybe because, you know, they do a bit more digging, if you know what I mean? Possibly. What is also kind of interesting, the CEO of this company was called J.W. Ray. His Twitter account was hacked, and he was just posting like spam. And the last entry was even like in September 2012. So maybe that company was also entirely fake. It was just a fake entity they created. And there's more fun. For instance, this domain Cloud Protect was registered by a guy called Papalopos Demetrio, which sounds like a Greek name. But he also registered cryptor.ch and tigerhealthcare.ch, 2 other domains. And Cryptor, for instance, was a kind of advertising platform offering startup financing. And this was actually part of one of the biggest cryptocurrency scams in history back in the days. They created a coin called Zeta coin, and the top developer there was called Conan Sarin, so he created Zeta coin. Now, it was a typical rug and pull scam. They just pretended to essentially work for mobile payments in Africa with Safaricom, for instance, which would at that time make it even more valuable than Bitcoin because people would be able to pay from their mobile phones. And he claimed to be in Kenya integrating it. The capitalization peaked $15 million, and then, you know, it just died and the fraud was exposed. $50 million is small compared to today's cryptocurrency fraud, which ranges in hundreds of millions. But it was like one of the earliest, most interesting scams. So what about Tiger Healthcare? Tiger Healthcare, there's actually two things here. Tigerhealthcare.ch, the one on the left is a fake. We think it's fake. The one on the right, tigerhealthcare.com, with the picture of Hong Kong, I think it is, they claim to have $170 billion in aggregate managed and investing those. So again, we think it was kind of a false flag. So we know that these people had, let's say, an interest toward investment bankers, knowledge. One of the craziest stories here was we found a very rich individual was targeted by them, and his laptop was infected. So he asked for help, we helped him, and we found the exact time and date when he was infected. So we asked him, what did you do on that date? He said, like, let me check. And he said, well, it's impossible because on that date I was on my yacht sailing in the Mediterranean. And we asked him, where was your laptop? He said, my laptop was in my villa, essentially guarded by bodyguards and so on. So later, I think he was able to find out that somebody paid his security guards in the villa to let them break into the home and infect his laptop through a physical attack. So they essentially were also doing kind of physical attacks during these incidents. Now, if you bring, let's say, all these things together, the ability to, let's say, investigate attacks, emergencies, and what we learn on them, let's say you can make kind of an analogy with the Big Bang, which is essentially how our universe was created. When the 2019 pandemic started, you know, I started thinking a lot about the universe. And it's somehow maybe similar like Isaac Newton, one of the greatest mathematicians and physicists. He lived through the Great Plague of 1666. So during this time, he isolated himself at home, at his family's estate, and just away from the world, just thinking, doing nothing, he came up with some of the most amazing advances in mathematics and physics, such as, for instance, the law of gravitation. Or the laws of motion, or the integral calculus, and so on. So I started to think a bit also about, let's say, the universe in a philosophical manner, and training in Taekwondo at the same time. I realized that there's a lot of similarities between how physics looks at the universe and how cybersecurity works. So for instance, Fritz Zwicky, he's one of the most unrecognized geniuses of the 20th century. He came up with this idea that galaxies contain huge amounts of invisible matter. He was Swiss, so he called them in German dunkle Matter, which means dark matter. So what he saw is that galaxies were actually spinning, but they were spinning too fast. And he said, well, obviously, if they're spinning so fast, they will disintegrate. So that means that there is more mass, more hidden matter in galaxies. So he was the first to suggest that the universe has actually even more dark matter than normal matter. Then Albert Einstein, he started thinking about Newton's law of gravitation, and that's how he came up with the general relativity theory. And when he came up with this famous equation now, he introduced a cosmological constant called lambda that you can see in there. It's a lambda g micro v. And this essentially, he said that the universe cannot either expand or collapse. It has to be somehow static. So he implemented this artificial constant, if you want, that would make the universe stable, not moving, not expanding. And later, I think that when Edwin Hubble discovered that the universe is actually expanding, Einstein called it the biggest mistake. But in reality, it's not a mistake. It's just the constant, the value of this constant actually accounts for the expansion of the universe and some kind of hidden residual energy into the universe that forces it to expand. So if you look at the universe, a distribution of energy matter in the universe, actually only 5% is real matter, 26% is dark matter, so that's like 5 times more than the visible matter is dark. We cannot see it. And the huge 69% of the universe is dark energy, which accounts for this expansion of the universe. So looking at this, I saw that cybersecurity is very much like the universe. There's a very big similarity here into how things actually operate. So if you put together what started the cybersecurity industry and let's say what accounts for top-level security research nowadays, I think that the ability to handle emergencies and big destructive attacks is one of them, very important. The ability to tackle disinformation and fake news is another one. Attribution and dealing with unsolved mysteries. The sophisticated attacks that everyone else missed, like the case of ShadowPad inside the NetSarang or the SolarWinds story, if you want. And the new attack vectors, which keep appearing all the time. Like it used to be maybe macros 20 years ago. It's still macros, unfortunately, but also there's new vectors to that, like cloud dimensions, data stored in the cloud, hacking of cloud keys, golden keys, and so on. So having the ability to understand all this is, I think, what can give you an edge in fighting in cybersecurity. If you want to, people ask me, what shall I do? And I say, if you want to work in cybersecurity, if you focus on any of this here, you'll probably have a pretty nice career, and you'll probably do fine. And so, in my opinion, these are, let's say, the most important thing in cybersecurity. Now, the third most important thing in cybersecurity, in my opinion, is logs and data. If you don't have logs and data, you can't do much without logs and data. So that's why I tell people that it's more important to have good logs before good defenses. And of course, what's left between the first and the third most important thing in security? I think the fact that the things we see and know are just a small fraction of what is actually happening around us. And similarly, if you think about the universe, our visible universe is only 5% of what's out there. So I like to think the same is pretty much valid in cybersecurity. What is happening out there is much bigger and greater than what we actually see. And it's up to us to develop the capability to discover the dark universe by extrapolating from the visible one, which is, what I hope that everyone will be able to do. So thank you very much for listening to my talk.
那我们非常谢谢 Costin 超级精彩的演讲，纵观了这30年的治安事件，并且用这个考古生物学的比喻，用物理学比喻告诉我们看到这 visibility 其实目前只有跟宇宙的5% 一样，我们需要更多的 log， 更多的这个治安的研究，然后看到这些隐藏的 APT、隐藏的这个威胁存在。Okay, so we can have a Q&A time. 有没有任何人有任何问题？ OK， 前面的朋友，对，麦克风可以按下去。
Thank you very much for the very informative sharing. I see you have done a lot of research on the domain detail at the back, but sometimes there is a very added service that which you could hidden domain information. Is there any way around that you could keep doing the research at the back to know who owned the domain and what's the things behind?
So if I understand correctly, you're asking how you can unmask domain registrant information, owner, history, because of GDPR, they're usually not visible, correct?
Not because of the GDPR, but sometimes they can add some service which call it privacy services, which
privacy.
you could hide the information at the behind. So I would like to know whether there is any way around you could figure out this kind of the barrier.
I think there are solutions that, let's say, people talk about, and there are solutions that people do not talk about, in the sense that they're like legal solutions, which is, for instance, just to, look for passive DNS overlaps or cookie reuse, like Google advertising ID on that particular domain. Or in sometimes we've seen that there is extended information about the domain owner in the TXT data of the domain. So sometimes, for instance, they put there the email address that registered the domain. It can be found there in the extended TXT data. I've seen a couple of cases recently where privacy protecting services, they leak the registrator data in there. But also, like from my experience and what I heard is there are companies who specialize in this technique. And the way this works is a bit tricky. When you register a domain, they essentially have tracking in there. So they know who registered which domain. So when the bad guys, let's say, try to register something on popular domain registration services, that's all sort of third-party cookies. And those third-party cookies, actually, they link what they're registering together. So there are some companies who specialize in providing this kind of unmasking services. But they probably are on the border of legal, like, is it legal or not? So yeah, I would look into that, like extended the DNS data for the domain, passive DNS history, NetFlow, if NetFlow is available, of course, and data from such companies. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're out of time.
Yes. So, 那因为时间的关系，所以我们再次用热烈的掌声感谢这个 Costin 的演讲。